Started Tarot Tales, the show that combines storytelling with the tarot. And I'm really excited tonight to be using the tarot of Pierre Madinet. It's a deck that's historical. It's a reproduction of a deck that dates to 1709. And one of the reasons why I like tarot so much is the history that's involved in it. And this deck is known to be one of the most beautiful of the traditional Marseille pattern decks. So I'm really looking forward to using that. We'll get into it more with our storytelling as we pair the cards with our storytellers. And if you haven't tuned into this show before, basically what happens is I bring a storyteller I like on. They share a story, and afterwards I pair it with an appropriate tarot card that matches the story. And then at the end of the night, we take all the cards that all the stories have generated and we put them together and we do a little bit of a collective reading for the night. And I'm really excited tonight to have a couple of my favorite storytellers in Los Angeles with me. We've had a lot of New York guests on, and the New Yorkers have all been wonderful. Like, it's been a great experience using technology to book people from outside the geographic area. But today is an LA heavy show with some of my LA favorites. And coming up to get us started is a wonderfully talented storyteller. I really appreciate him taking the time to be with us tonight. Please welcome Emerson Dameron.
Thank you, Ryan. It's good to be here. One of the most widely misinterpreted quotations from 20th century literature is Jean-Paul Sartre's "Hell is other people." And my original plan for tonight was to explain this using MLA format with footnotes and citations, but Brian told me that didn't really fit the format of carded tarot tales. So instead, I'm going to talk about my experience with hell being other people. I've always thought this was a cool quotation. When I was a teenager, I thought it meant people are annoying, which is true, and that's part of it, but it's not really the essence. As I understand it now, as long as you're in the world with other people, if you're in someone else's eye shot, you are always partly an object. You can never be purely a subject, and that limits your freedom. But life is a trade-off between freedom and security, and sometimes if you need security, being an object has its advantages. To wit, about 5 years ago, I decided to move back to Los Angeles. I was moving along in my writing career. I had ridden out the recession in Chicago, and I had just gotten a certificate that declared that I was an experience designer, whatever that is. So I decided to pursue my career as a freelance writer and experience designer in my spiritual hometown of Los Angeles. My plan was to come back and kick around, maybe couch surf for a little bit until I found an apartment for maybe a little bit more than the $800 a month that I was paying in Glendale back in 2010, because you've got to factor in inflation. After a couple of months, I was starting to bottom out. I had called in all of the favors that I had among my friends. I had used up all of the kindness that was there. And one afternoon, I remember a drug addict dropping me off in Echo Park and screaming at me that if he wanted to, he could ruin my life. And he was probably right, because there was not much of a life to ruin. I got on Airbnb and I got a space in something called Podshare. Podshare is a startup. It's an experiment of sorts in disruptive real estate in the era of a completely ridiculous West Coast housing crisis. If you check into PodShare, basically you get a bunk. You have free Sling TV that you can watch. And it's basically you live in a submarine cabin. There are a bunch of other people there. It's all bunks, and everyone can see what everyone else is doing. Their tagline, if I recall, is "End World Loneliness," because you will not be lonely in PodShare ever. There is a sense of community there that can kill farm animals. It's sort of like prison, except that everyone is young and hot and at least pretending that they're excited to be there. So I spend a few days in PodShare, which turn into a few weeks because my freelancing career is not taking off the way that I hoped it would. I am by no means crushing it. I'm getting some freelance gigs, but I'm basically going week to week in PodShare, and I'm sinking into ice cold depression. I don't have a lot of money, so I've stopped eating very much, which is okay because I don't really have much of an appetite. Generally, if I get through a day of slapping my keyboard and creating content, I can celebrate with a Subway sandwich, the 6-inch. I don't want to be too extravagant. And I generally work in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I walk around Little Tokyo and the Arts District, some of my favorite city blocks on Earth, and I feel like I'm drowning in squid ink. One of the many indignities of severe depression is the opportunity cost. And I really do regret that I did not more easily connect with the people that I was surrounded by at PodShare because they were very interesting. There was a guy who was trying to start a Shopify empire and be a digital nomad, and you could kind of see him over the course of a couple of weeks figuring out that the 4-hour work week was going to be more like an 80-hour work week, or he was going to run out of money, especially because he was spending it all on partying with the gorgeous exchange students that were living in PodShare, where there are rules, but they are not rigorously enforced. You are not supposed to have sex in the pods. People break this rule all the time. You're not supposed to do drugs in the pods, but it's referred to as pot share by the Dutch and German travelers who go out around the back and smoke weed about 6 to 9 times a day. There is a French electronic musician who has all of the hallmarks of being one of the most interesting people I never really got to know, but I'm just not connecting with people at all. I'm extremely depressed and shut off and in my own little cocoon in my bunk, but I am safe in a sense. At one point, the founder of PodShare asks me, "Hey, do you think that living in PodShare is a good treatment for depression?" Because that's one of the things that I had in mind when I created it. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. However, it is very good at making it inconvenient to kill oneself. Because having a nervous breakdown or doing anything rash while you're surrounded by a couple of dozen strangers would be incredibly rude. And no matter how depressed I get, I will always be polite. So I just kind of lie there screaming internally as PodShare starts to get some media attention. We had the local Fox channel did a segment, Vice magazine showed up. There were some articles written. I was in some of the articles and videos on one of the BuzzFeed videos. You can see me in my bunk pretending to sleep because if I'm going to create content, I have to get paid for it. There's one guy in Podshare whom I refer to as Ketamine Bro. Ketamine Bro is the scion of a fading New Jersey real estate empire, and he seems to have fallen on very hard times. He is in Los Angeles so that he can go to one of the clinics around town that does ketamine infusions as a frontier treatment for depression. And at night, Ketamine Bro and I tend to be pacing around in the alley together on our phones. He's fighting with his dad about money. I'm fighting with my wife about money. We obviously have a lot in common. And I'm talking to him one day after he has just come back from getting his ketamine infusion, and I realize that I'm starting to say more than I really want to. And I start saying, he asks me how I'm doing, and I say, to be totally honest with you, I'm extremely depressed. I feel like I'm drowning. Having all of these eyes on me is keeping me technically safe, but I feel like if my career doesn't take off, or nothing picks up, or I don't get some evidence that someone on Earth cares, my plan is to go to the top of the Aeon Tower and dry dive onto the pavement, which will be my great defining achievement in the field of experience design. And I hear this come out of my mouth and I think, what the fuck am I doing? Why am I telling this guy all of this? And Ketamine Bro just looks at me and says, it's going to be okay, Emerson. You're going to have an interesting life. And I ask him how he knows this. And he says, because I can see the future. And that's when I decide that I'm going to try ketamine infusions. Thank you.
that was wonderful, and there were a few different cards I was tempted to pair with that story. I'm always tempted. There are certain cards that hit things right on the nose, and so just with the hell is other people and the pod situation, I was thinking about the devil for a little bit, the devil card, and one of the things that's interesting about it is there's an element of self-bondage in a lot of the imagery of the devil card, where there's chains or ropes around necks of two of the figures that are enthralled to the devil, but they're loose, and if these figures had enough consciousness, they could slip those chains off. And so there's a lot of that reminds me of some of my own experiences with depression. But ultimately, what I feel like that story really encapsulates is a major arcana card called the Wheel, or the Wheel of Fortune, and it remains one of my favorite cards because it's very much about the cyclical nature of life, how sometimes you're on top and then fortune spins its wheel, and sometimes you go down and sometimes you come back up, and there's not always, you can't always see a pattern or a reason to it, but the wheel always turns. And I feel like the way Emerson told that story, he turned the wheel both with his move to come to Los Angeles and to try new things, and to get into this PodShare situation, which, oh man, that is not something I feel like I would be eager to experience. But I think that over the course of his story, he opens himself up to the turning of the wheel, and the introduction to Ketamine Bro. That story leaves off with, I feel like the wheel is about to turn, and even though for a lot of the story Emerson's on the bottom, I feel like that story ends with the hope of the wheel continuing to turn and the ability to rise again. So I think that's a wonderful story. I'm so glad Emerson was with us tonight to share that. And I'm going with the Wheel of Fortune for that. And coming up for our next story is one I'm going to share. And then at the end of that, rather than trying to get insight into my own story, I'm going to just draw a card at random and then try to fit that card into what I just spoke about. And so far when I've done this, it's worked out surprisingly well, so I hope that continues. But my story is, it takes me back to the 90s, and I found myself in a parking lot, and I've never been a fan of Cadillacs, so I don't know what model of Cadillac I'm looking at. But it's brand new, it's a bright green metallic two-door, it's idling in front of me, and I want to drive it. Not only do I want to drive it, but I want to steal it. Like, the owner of this car has just left it with its engine running and walked away, and it's there in front of me. And it has this attraction that I haven't experienced in my life up until this point, where I really want to do something that I know is theoretically wrong, but just there's this huge voice inside of my head screaming that I should joyride this car, and I don't. I can't bring myself to do it. It's too much. It's too much of a hard break with my privileged upper middle class upbringing. It's like it feels like a step too far, and then also, I don't trust that someone would just leave their car running. I feel like it's a trap of some sort, that maybe the police are behind it. Maybe they're waiting for someone to steal this car. So the car goes unstolen despite this monumental attraction that taking it and joyriding it had for me. But I regret this because I have this... I have an anxious side to my personality. Like, I was rebelling against the school I went to that I absolutely hated, and like I broke into the school over winter break one time and painted an anarchy sign in front of one of the bathrooms, and then I spent 2 sleepless nights paranoid about all the trouble I was going to get into, and I went back into school still over break. No one had seen this graffiti yet, and I cleaned it up. I erased all trace of it that it was ever there, and I was thinking, you know, this alternate version of the badass version of me in my head, the Ryan that stole the car. I was like, the Ryan that stole the car would stand by his graffiti and his rebellious gesture. He would let that stand in the world. He wouldn't out of paranoia erase that. You know, he would commit to his rebellious persona. And like, you know, the Ryan that stole the car, he wouldn't be embarrassed to tell the girl that he had a crush on, that he liked her. And there was this alternate life that I was living in my head that was the things that the Ryan would steal the car would have done. And as I got into high school, the worlds merged a little bit. I became a little less anxious about things like that. And part of that was the introduction of alcohol to the social scene. One of the things we would do in high school is there was a golf course when we would go in and steal their range balls and then tee them off into a canyon, which now the environmental consequences of that haunt me, that I was just hitting golf balls into this beautiful natural canyon. But it was a fun Saturday night in high school. It would be to drink beer and launch golf balls down into this canyon. And one night, just launching the golf balls turns out not to be enough to satisfy our teenage angst with the world. And next to this canyon we're driving the golf balls down into, we notice there's a construction site. There's a house under construction, and it's walled off in this fenced lot where there's been some excavation, and there's a truck down there. And we decide we're going to explore the construction site. And one of the things on the construction site is there's a Bobcat tractor, and out of just, I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I drove a Jeep Cherokee at the time, and I took the keys to my Jeep Cherokee and I put them in the ignition of this Bobcat tractor, and I turn the keys and it fires right up. Like magically my key also works for this tractor. And we're we're all amazed that that happened. And I don't know how to drive a tractor, but there's these pedals that I press on the beginning, at the front part of the tractor, and it raises the scoop. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to drive forward. So I pressed forward on the pedals to raise the scoop, and so I pressed backwards on them, thinking that will lower the scoop. But it doesn't. It tilts a different part of the scoop even higher up, and the entire tractor gets off balance and tilts forward. And I turn off the ignition and jump down, and obviously someone's been messing with the construction equipment now. And now we're fired up. Like to our teenage brains, this was like a drug, the fact that this tractor started up. So now we're looking all over the construction site for something else to drive. And there's an old beat-up F-650 pickup truck. And we pile into the pickup truck, and someone, it was like out of a movie. The keys were tucked into the visor. We lower the visor, and there are the keys to this pickup truck. And we all are, there's like 6 or 7 of us, and we can't believe our luck. And we start this pickup truck. There's 4 of us are jammed in the cab. 2 of us are hanging onto the back. And we drive this pickup truck all around this construction site. But it's a very small, fenced-in site. And we want to escape the construction site and get this truck out into the larger world. And it's missing a few gears. It goes from like first gear, it's a manual transmission truck, and it goes from like first gear to third gear. And we try to get off the construction site by driving up this hill into this chain link fence. And the truck just, it barely rolls up this hill, and it just keeps bouncing off this fence we're trying to crash it through. And we roll up the hill and crash into this fence and bounce off and roll back down the hill. And we do this like 4 or 5 times until we get paranoid about the amount of noise we're making. And we abandon the plan to take this truck out into the wider world. We leave it on the construction site where we found it. And we all we run home, and I was sort of ensconced. I was caught up in the moment and also ensconced in the denial of what we'd done for a while. And I was sitting there in bed, and I was like, "Oh my God, we went joyriding. Like that was a joyride." I was like, "Joyriding is a form of stealing. Like we stole the car. Like I've turned into my alter ego. I am now the Ryan that stole the car. Like we borrowed this truck without permission. Like this was stealing. I was now the Ryan that stole the car, and I felt like I felt like myself merged with this fictional reality that I'd created of who I would be if I had stolen that car all those years ago when I found the Cadillac in the parking lot. And it gave me it didn't last, but it gave me this newfound sense of confidence. I walked into high school the Monday after that all happened, feeling 10 feet tall. That now I was this badass, and I thought my life. I bought into the idea that there could be definitive moments in your life that change you forever, and I thought everything was going to be different now that I had stolen a car, and except for that short burst of confidence, nothing fundamentally changed. And then what I came to realize was it's a little bit like the time traveler's paradox. Like my life didn't change because I always was the Ryan that would steal the car. Like I always had that in me. It wasn't me verging with an alternate version of myself. It was who I was all along. And I still had my insecurities. I still had my angst. I still had insecurity over who I was in the world. And that was how I discovered that we can create versions of who we wish to be, we were, or who we want to be, and we can sometimes peg those to individual events. But that we're ultimately, at the end of the day, we are ourselves. And unfortunately, not there. It takes more than a single act of rebellion to change who you are. It takes fundamental work on who you are as a person. It takes expensive and time-consuming things like therapy, not a burst of criminal activity in your high school years. But I was the Ryan that stole the car. Thank you guys so much. I like that story. I've told it a few different ways. And I like this one, and I'm gonna hopefully pick a card that goes well with that. And the card I've selected is the Seven of Swords, and that actually works really well for the story because the swords are about the mind, but also about conflict and some insecurity, and there's some difficulty with the sevens, but also there's idea of progress, and so I think the story ends with it begins with me wishing I was a different person or I had the ability to be a different person, and it ends with taking what I thought the step would be to change who I was, but really what just reflected back of me is that I am who I am, and it's going to take fundamental work to change who I am as a person. And so I think that works out rather nicely, and I'm very excited to, on the back of that, introduce our next storyteller. And she's a wonderful storyteller. She's a Moth winner. You can catch her killing it at the Moth, and I can't. She's on my short list of people I'm really excited to see when we get off quarantine and we go back to normalcy. I'm really looking forward to seeing her in person, but we're very fortunate to have her with us virtually this evening. Please welcome Julia Leshner.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. There's a story in my family that is a real point of pride. It takes place in the early 1960s in suburban southern New Jersey. And the story is about my grandmother having her 4 daughters beat up a group of neighborhood children. And this is told with fondness and nostalgia. Apparently, one of the girls in the family was being bullied at school, so she came home one day after some name calling, and my grandmother said, "Get in the car," and she took her 4 little girls to the bullying children's home and told them to get out of the car and beat up the kids for what they had done. They did it, they got back in the car, and then my grandmom took them all home and then put dinner on the table. And again, this is told fondly and warmly by members of my family, even though today it could probably land you in jail or at least with some sort of suspension. Remember when Mom had us get in the car and just beat the shit out of a bunch of assholes? Those were the days. When I moved to Los Angeles about 8 years ago, one of the things that I learned was I had to hide the New Jersey that was in me. I learned that people don't necessarily appreciate what I consider to be a very direct East Coast approach to situations. I was told it was perhaps too honest, too mean, maybe too bitchy to be direct with people. For example, it might be, normal in New Jersey or in an East Coast office to let someone know if there's an error in their work. Here, unheard of. Pointing out to your boss that his vaping is disruptive to the office culture. Julia, how could you do that? Suggesting that perhaps wearing a bohemian-style tube top to the office might be unprofessional. That's absolutely uncalled for. How could you do that? So after I had a few different positions, I started to learn I just needed to bottle that jersey up like some bad self-tanner, keep it down, and not let people know the real Jersey Julia that's deep within. I got a job at a Burbank office about 3 years ago, and my approach when taking that position was I was just going to be a laid-back, super cool Cali girl, very chill. If someone turned something in late, no big deal, because you know what? California Julia, she's on Cali time. It doesn't matter when you get your assignments in anymore. That Jersey part of me was so deep down, I nearly forgot about it. Until one day, my coworker, Lisa, looked up suddenly from her desk and said, "My AirPods are gone. Someone stole them." Immediately, it was like a switch had been flipped and the jersey came back up in me so quickly. Our office divided between 2 different groups of people. There were the West Coast people who thought, maybe she just misplaced them, or a good Samaritan probably found her AirPods and is just holding on to them for her. And then there were the East Coast folks. Myself, Lisa, and Frank were all from the Jersey, Philly region, and we knew that that was probably not the case. Lisa was able to look at that geo-tracking thing that AirPods have, and she had traced her AirPods to a house that was right next to our office building. So I did what any Jersey girl would do. I looked at Lisa and I said, "Get your car. Frank, are you coming with us?" He didn't even really know what was happening yet, but he said, "Sure, yeah, where are we going?" Because when you're from Jersey, you're ready to throw down and fight somebody, and you don't even really need a reason why. You just need the people in your life to tell you that you're getting in the car. The West Coast people that we worked with seemed immediately very nervous about what we were doing. One of them turned to me and said, "Wait, what's the plan? What are you guys going to do?" And I said, "Someone stole Lisa's AirPods. We're just going to go over there and handle it. We're going to assemble a crew and handle it." "How are you going to handle it, Julia?" "Don't worry about it," I said. Now, the West Coast people we worked with started getting really nervous about how we were going to go about doing this. But again, this is how you handle a situation. We know where the AirPods are. Let's just walk in a house, bust down this person's door, and fuck them up. Get the AirPods back. That's what you do. You can't just let someone steal your AirPods. I'm able to talk one of my West Coast team members. He grew up in the OC and he's very timid, but he really loves heist movies and the idea of being a part of a group. And I convinced him to come along with us, even though there's no way he can fight. He's just an additional body to have in the car to look intimidating. Then we're able to get 2 more of our coworkers to sign on once they find out that we're just going to hop past their favorite takeout lunch place on the way back from beating this person up. So now we have an entire full crew. Lisa turns to everybody and offers a reward for getting her stolen AirPods back by saying, "If any of you guys come with me to beat this motherfucker up, I'm going to get some cheesesteaks from Philly's Best for lunch." I really love that she found the one cheesesteak place in all of Burbank, California to feed us after we stomped this guy for taking our AirPods. I am so pumped. I turn back to Lisa and I say, "You know what? I actually packed my lunch, but I'm willing to stomp this bitch for free. This will not stand. No one's going to take your AirPods like this. Let's get in the car and go." And we're getting really amped up right now, and my heart rate's up, and I'm in this business casual outfit, but I'm already sweating because I'm so excited to go and have a purpose and a group of people that I want to defend. And then that's when we hear this pinging noise coming out of her Patagonia jacket that's sitting on her office chair. And Lisa just looks in her little pocket and discovers her AirPods. They've been there the whole time. It turns out her husband works for Apple, and he said oh, the geolocation thing is not super exact, so it's kind of just within a 1-block radius. So it looked like it was in some guy's house right next to our office, a man whose name we'd looked up, any of his information we were able to find on Google. He was innocent. Lisa had just misplaced the AirPods the entire time. Huh, what do you know? She laughed it off, and my other coworkers laughed it off, and then Lisa said, "Well, I'll still put in a lunch order for Philly's Best if you guys want to choose some sandwiches." And everyone turns back to their desk having a great time. And I'm just sitting in my cubicle, stewing, looking at the pre-packed lunch that I made for myself, the unbridled aggression I never got to put out on some fool, some AirPod-thieving asshole who doesn't even exist. That was my chance to shine. That was my chance to be just like my grandma and my aunts and my mom, going to someone's house to handle it. But just like a runny, hot bottle of spray tanner on a summer day, once the Jersey comes out, it's just really hard to bottle it back up. My name's Julia Lechner. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
I love that story. There's so many fun elements with that, and Emerson's story, I went through a couple different cards that I thought might fit as you were telling it, and the one is the Queen of Swords, and there's a progression in the swords where the Page of Swords is just barely learning how to use it. And then the King of Swords, he's the master of the sword, and he's so much in control of it, he doesn't even have to pull it out. But the Queen of Swords, she'll cut you with it. She's in control of it, and she'll use it to cut you. And so I was thinking of that as a strong contender as I was hearing that story. But ultimately, what I decided to pair with that is what I find to be a particularly gorgeous card is the moon. And there's a few things in the card that sort of makes me feel that it's appropriate. And one is there's sort of it has a lot to do with the unconsciousness and stuff coming out of the deep. And there's two animals on it, and the traditional interpretations are the wolf and the dog, and there's sort of our domesticated side and our wild side, and there's the tension between the two, and having control of them both. And I like that, and there's sort of the waters represent sort of our unconsciousness or the subconscious mind, and there's a creature emerging from it. And I feel like in Julia's story that there was this effort in the office to sort of be like the domesticated dog, to sort of ignore the wolf nature, and to put some gloss on who she really was. And then the second it looked like something went down, like here's this creature that was buried coming out of the deep to represent like the Jersey side of things. And I think I love any moment where there's this there's this West Coast, oh, it's okay, everything's okay, we're all good, there's no drama, there's no problem here, and sometimes there is a problem here, and I like that, even though the AirPods ended up just to be misplaced, not stolen, I like that this creature that represented Julia's upbringing and the story she heard from her parents, like the tension with the AirPods gave birth to this, and she let the shield, the disguise drop, and her true self emerge. I think that's so much fun, and I absolutely I love stories. There's sort of a false, sometimes there's this idea that, oh, we're all the same, but like geography really does in a way define us all, and I like I'd like to channel, I'm West Coast born and bred, but I would like to channel my inner Jersey sometimes. So I love that story and that coming out. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Julia. And that is the conclusion of our storytelling portion of this show. We're doing a little bit shorter shows going forward. But now is the fun part, but also the part that puts a little stress on me. I'm going to take the cards that have come up through all these stories and put them together and try to come up with a little reading. And there is, just because of the situation in the world with coronavirus and our self-quarantining, that's made its way into a couple of the readings so far, and so we might get a little peek of that, but our cards again were the Wheel of Fortune for Emerson and his story with handling depression while living in the pot of exposure. There was my story about finding out that stealing a car won't change your life, and that was the Seven of Swords. And then Julia's story, ready to throw down for a coworker to return some misappropriated AirPods, and those cards they relate to each other pretty nicely, and I think the Wheel of Fortune is very much the state of the world right now, where I think we're all kind of taking things day by day, at least on a personal level. One day I'm okay with everything. I'm doing pretty well in the quarantine. I feel like I'm thriving in spite of everything. And then the next thing, the wheel turns and I'm down, and I can't quite peg it to a single cause. It's just day by day things are changing. And I think we're finding ourselves in such a new situation that there is this aspect of the wheel turning for everyone, that we're in flux. And that gives way to the Seven of Swords, and the sevens are they have to do with the thinking function in the mind. but also sort of with conflict. And there's the seven is there's sort of a breakthrough in the sevens where forces that have sort of been at a stalemate, there's progress. And so I think with the things that are going on with the world at the current moment, that the takeaway from this card is not to not to have a stalemate in our minds, not to have a lack of action. We need to, in spite of the situation of the world, we need to take steps to continue to move forward in our own ways, and to unlock our progression. And with Julia's card with the moon, not only are we using our mind in the previous card to sort of unlock a stalemate and to move forward, but with the moon, there's things that are buried, coming forward and coming into the light. And I think one of the things to keep in mind with the situation with the quarantine is that things are going to emerge from within us, and we have to honor those things, things that are maybe buried or that in the that we don't pay full attention to as we go about our daily routines. When we're caught up in the hustle and bustle of the daily grind, that there are aspects of ourselves that are important that we maybe aren't taking time to focus on or to honor. And with the world slowing down due to the quarantine, we can focus on those elements and sort of honor elements of ourself that are normally beyond consciousness. And that also, as things emerge, there's the path we have to thread between the two animals, the domesticated dog and the wild wolf. So I think sort of the takeaway from the reading is that we're very much in a situation where it seems we're at the mercy of fortune and at random circumstances outside of our control, but that with the mental function within our own minds, we can take control over that somewhat and progress a little bit. And as we do that, things that we normally, in the conscious light of our everyday activities that we don't normally honor or have time for, will emerge. And that one of the ways through one of the ways through for us will be to acknowledge those elements of ourselves that we don't normally get a chance to see all the time, and to pay attention to it, and direct our focus where we sometimes block it out with our routines. And that is our show for this week. I'm so glad. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm so glad you are all a part of it. Thank you to Emerson. Thank you to Julia. I absolutely adored the stories this week. I like. I have a lot of follow-up questions for both our storytellers. I'm so thrilled to be able to do this. I really enjoy. I love hearing from different perspectives. I love checking in with the storytelling community and carrying on with something that was an important part of my life pre-quarantine. I'm glad to have a venue to keep doing this. So thank you so much to everyone. And we will be back next week with another show. I hope you'll return then and to see you all back. Thank you so much.